December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. Belgian time. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was asleep at his headquarters in Versailles, France when the telephone rang. His Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, was calling with reports from the Ardennes sector. German artillery was shelling American positions along an 85-mile front. German infantry and armor were attacking in heavy fog. American units were reporting massive enemy concentrations. Communications were breaking down. This didn't make sense. Allied intelligence had repeatedly assessed that Germany was finished, that German forces were incapable of major offensive operations, that the war would be over by Christmas. Eisenhower had believed those assessments. He had positioned his weakest, most inexperienced divisions in the Ardennes precisely because intelligence indicated it was a quiet sector where nothing would happen. Now something was happening, something big. Over the next 48 hours, as reports continued to arrive, Eisenhower would realize the full scope of his miscalculation. Germany had secretly concentrated 30 divisions, over 400,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 2,600 artillery pieces in the Ardennes forest. They had done this without Allied intelligence detecting it. They had achieved complete surprise against the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus ever assembled. And now German forces were driving deep into American lines, threatening to split the Allied armies in two, possibly even reaching the Channel ports and cutting off supplies to millions of Allied soldiers. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II, had begun. And it began because Eisenhower and his intelligence chiefs had fundamentally misunderstood Germans' capabilities and intentions. This wasn't just a tactical surprise. This was a strategic intelligence failure of the first magnitude. To understand how the Allies were so completely deceived, we need to go back to September 1944. That month, Allied forces were advancing rapidly across France and Belgium. Paris had been liberated on August 25th. By early September, Allied spearheads had reached the German border. The mood at Allied headquarters was euphoric. The war seemed nearly won. Germany appeared to be collapsing. Allied intelligence assessments painted a picture of German disintegration. The Wehrmacht had lost over 500,000 men in France. Equipment losses were staggering. German units were retreating in disorder. The German economy was being strangled by strategic bombing. Oil production facilities were destroyed. Transportation networks were disrupted. Allied intelligence concluded that Germany lacked the resources to continue effective resistance. Victory was just a matter of time, possibly weeks, certainly before the end of 1944. Eisenhower shared this optimism. In September 1944, he approved Operation Market Garden, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's ambitious plan to drop 3 airborne divisions in Holland to seize bridges leading to Germany's industrial heartland. The operation assumed German resistance would be minimal, that German forces were too disorganized to mount effective opposition. Market Garden failed catastrophically. British airborne forces at Arnhem were surrounded and destroyed. The operation revealed that Allied intelligence had dramatically underestimated German capabilities. German forces, supposedly disorganized and defeated, had responded rapidly and effectively. They had concentrated armor quickly. They had fought with skill and determination. The comfortable assumptions about German collapse were wrong. But Allied intelligence didn't revise their assessments. They attributed Market Garden's failure to bad luck, to unexpected presence of SS Panzer divisions refitting near Arnhem. They continued to believe that overall German capability was deteriorating rapidly. By November 1944, the Allied advance had stalled, not because of German strength, Allied commanders believed, but because of logistics. The rapid advance across France had outrun supply lines. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was rationed. The port of Antwerp, captured in early September, wasn't operational until late November because German forces held the Scheldt estuary. Once logistics were sorted out, Allied commanders believed, the advance would resume and Germany would collapse. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was reading German communications. Not all of them, but enough to provide insight into German planning and capabilities. Ultra, the British code-breaking operation, had been reading German Enigma encrypted messages since 1941. By late 1944, Allied intelligence believed they had a comprehensive picture of German dispositions and intentions. They were confident that any major German operation would be detected in advance through signals intelligence. This confidence was misplaced. The Germans were about to demonstrate that even with compromised communications, even with Allied air superiority, even with apparent resource exhaustion, they could still achieve strategic surprise. The architect of this deception was Adolf Hitler himself. After the failure of the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler had consolidated absolute control over German military planning. He trusted no one. He excluded most of the officer corps from strategic decisions, and he began planning an operation that would shock the Allies and possibly change the course of the war. Hitler's plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. German forces would attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, the same route Germany had used successfully in 1940. They would drive northwest toward Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies, cutting off British and Canadian forces in Holland, potentially forcing another Dunkirk evacuation. With the northern Allied armies destroyed or trapped, Germany could negotiate a separate peace with Britain and the United States, then turn all forces east against the Soviet Union.
Hitler's senior generals considered the plan insane. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander in the West, argued that Germany lacked the resources for such an ambitious operation. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, which would execute the attack, called it a fantasy. They proposed a smaller operation with limited objectives. Hitler refused. The operation would proceed as he designed it or not at all. The generals, cowed by Hitler's authority and fearing his wrath after the July assassination attempt, complied. Planning began in absolute secrecy. Only a handful of officers knew the operation's full scope. Most commanders learned their roles just days before the attack. All planning was done by courier, never by radio. No written orders were transmitted electronically. Staff officers hand-carried documents in locked cases. This extreme security had a purpose. Hitler assumed correctly that the Allies were reading German radio communications. By eliminating radio traffic related to the offensive, Hitler made the operation invisible to Allied signals intelligence. The Ardennes was chosen specifically because Allied intelligence considered it unsuitable for major operations. The terrain was heavily forested, hilly, with few roads. Allied commanders believed armor couldn't operate effectively there, especially in winter. The sector was held by 4 American divisions, 2 of them inexperienced units sent there for quiet sector training, 2 of them veteran divisions pulled out of heavy fighting for rest and refitting. The 106th Infantry Division had just arrived in Europe. The 28th Infantry Division was rebuilding after heavy losses in the Hürtgen Forest. The 4th Infantry Division was recovering from the D-Day landings and subsequent fighting. The 99th Infantry Division was new to combat. These divisions held an 85-mile front, far too long for proper defense, but Allied intelligence assessed the risk as minimal. German preparations were extensive and carefully concealed. 3 German armies were concentrated: the 6th Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, and the 7th Army in the south. The 6th Panzer Army included elite SS Panzer divisions, the best remaining units in the German military. These units were withdrawn from the Eastern Front and refitted with new tanks, including the formidable King Tiger. Fuel was accumulated through heroic efforts, draining reserves from across Germany. Ammunition was stockpiled. The Luftwaffe scraped together over 1,000 aircraft for ground support. All of this was done without alerting Allied intelligence. How? The Germans used every deception technique available. Units moved only at night. Vehicles had mufflers installed to reduce noise. Artillery was positioned carefully to avoid aerial detection. Dummy radio traffic was broadcast in other sectors to suggest operations elsewhere. German agents spread rumors of defensive preparations. The result was that by December 15, 1944, over 400,000 German troops with 1,400 tanks were positioned in the Ardennes, and Allied intelligence had no idea. There were warning signs. Allied intelligence did detect some German unit movements. Prisoner interrogations revealed hints of an offensive. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over the Ardennes increased in November. But Allied intelligence analysts dismissed these indicators. The unit movements were interpreted as defensive repositioning. Prisoner reports were considered exaggerations or deceptions. The reconnaissance flights were attributed to routine monitoring. Allied intelligence was suffering from confirmation bias. They believed Germany was defeated, so they interpreted all evidence through that lens. Information contradicting their assumptions was dismissed as anomalous or unreliable. This is a classic intelligence failure pattern, and the Allies were falling into it completely. On December 12, 1944, a captured German soldier told interrogators about preparations for a major offensive. The report reached Allied headquarters. It was filed and forgotten. On December 14th, increased German artillery activity was reported in the Ardennes. Intelligence officers noted it, but assessed it as harassing fire, nothing significant. On December 15th, civilians in German-occupied territory reported large-scale troop movements. These reports reached Allied intelligence, but were given low priority. Even experienced intelligence officers who should have recognized these indicators failed to connect them into a coherent picture. The assumption that Germany was incapable of major offensive operations was so deeply embedded that contradictory evidence was simply ignored. This is a classic intelligence failure pattern, and the Allies were falling into it completely. On December 12, 1944, a captured German soldier told interrogators about preparations for a major offensive. The report reached Allied headquarters. It was filed and forgotten. On December 14th, increased German artillery activity was reported in the Ardennes. Intelligence officers noted it, but assessed it as harassing fire, nothing significant. On December 15th, civilians in German-occupied territory reported large-scale troop movements. These reports reached Allied intelligence, but were given low priority. Even experienced intelligence officers who should have recognized these indicators failed to connect them into a coherent picture. The assumption that Germany was incapable of major offensive operations was so deeply embedded that contradictory evidence was simply ignored. On December 16, 5:30 a.m., German artillery opened fire along the entire Ardennes front. Over 2,600 guns fired simultaneously, the largest German artillery bombardment on the Western Front since 1940. American positions were hammered with high explosive and shrapnel. Communications lines were cut, command posts were destroyed. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Then, in heavy fog that grounded Allied aircraft, German infantry and armor attacked. The 6th Panzer Army struck the northern sector, aiming for Liège and Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army hit the center, targeting the Meuse River crossings. The 7th Army attacked in the south to protect the offensive's southern flank. American units, outnumbered and overwhelmed, fought desperately. Some positions held, many were overrun. Within hours, German forces had penetrated several kilometers into American lines. The fog was both blessing and curse for the Germans. It prevented Allied aircraft from attacking German columns, allowing the offensive to develop without air interference. But it also slowed German advances, made coordination difficult, and prevented German forces from exploiting initial successes as quickly as planned. Still, by the end of the first day, German forces had achieved significant gains. 2 regiments of the American 106th Division were surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. The 28th Division's front was shattered. German spearheads were advancing rapidly in multiple sectors. At Allied headquarters, confusion reigned.
Initial reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Some reported local attacks. Others described major assaults. Communications with forward units were disrupted. Intelligence officers struggled to assess the situation. Was this a local counterattack?
A spoiling attack to disrupt expected Allied offensives? Or something bigger? By midday, December 16th, the scale was becoming apparent. This wasn't a local attack. This was a major offensive involving multiple German armies. Eisenhower was briefed at his Versailles headquarters. He immediately grasped the seriousness. He ordered 2 American armored divisions, the 7th and 10th, to move immediately to the Ardennes. He placed all available reserves on alert. But Eisenhower was shocked by the intelligence failure. How had Germany concentrated such forces without detection? Where had they found the resources? How had they achieved such complete surprise? The intelligence post-mortem would be brutal. Allied intelligence had failed at every level. Strategic intelligence had misjudged German capabilities. Tactical intelligence had missed the concentration of forces. Signals intelligence had been deceived by German radio silence. Aerial reconnaissance had failed to detect the buildup. Human intelligence from agents and prisoners had been dismissed. The failure was comprehensive and catastrophic. But recriminations would wait. The immediate crisis required all attention. German forces were driving deep into Allied lines. If they reached the Meuse River and crossed it, the situation would become desperate. If they actually reached Antwerp, as Hitler intended, the Allied position in northwest Europe might collapse. Eisenhower responded decisively. On December 17th, he ordered the 101st Airborne Division to rush to Bastogne, a critical road junction in the center of the German advance. He ordered the 82nd Airborne Division to the northern shoulder of the penetration. He redirected supplies and reinforcements to the threatened sector. He contacted Field Marshal Montgomery and ordered British forces to prepare defensive positions west of the Meuse in case German forces broke through. Most controversially, he placed Montgomery in command of all Allied forces north of the German penetration, giving the British Field Marshal control over 2 American armies. This decision was militarily sound, but politically explosive. American generals resented Montgomery's appointment. But Eisenhower knew that with communications disrupted, unified command north of the Bulge was essential. By December 19th, the German offensive had created a massive bulge in Allied lines, giving the battle its name. German forces had advanced up to 50 miles in some sectors. The surrounded regiments of the 106th Division had surrendered, over 7,000 men taken prisoner, the largest American surrender in the European theater. Bastogne was surrounded but still held by the 101st Airborne. German spearheads were approaching the Meuse at Dinant. The situation looked dire. But the German offensive was already running into problems. Fuel shortages were crippling. German units had been told to capture American fuel dumps. But American forces had destroyed or evacuated most dumps before Germans could reach them. German tanks were running dry. Traffic jams on narrow Ardennes roads delayed reinforcements. American resistance, though initially overwhelmed, was stiffening. Small unit actions were delaying German advances. Engineers were blowing bridges. Ad hoc defensive positions were forming. Most critically, the weather was improving. On December 23rd, the fog cleared. Allied aircraft, grounded for a week, took to the skies in massive numbers. Allied fighter bombers attacked German columns mercilessly. Supply convoys were destroyed. Advancing armor was hit repeatedly. German forces, which had advanced relatively freely under fog cover, were now exposed to devastating air attack. The Luftwaffe's 1,000 aircraft attempted to provide cover, but were outnumbered and outfought by Allied air superiority. By Christmas Day, the German offensive had stalled. German spearheads were still short of the Meuse. Bastogne still held, tying down German forces needed elsewhere. American reinforcements were arriving in massive numbers. General George Patton's Third Army had disengaged from its positions in the south, wheeled 90 degrees north, and was attacking the southern flank of the German Bulge. This maneuver, planned and executed in just days, was a logistical masterpiece. On December 26th, Patton's forces broke through to Bastogne, ending its encirclement. The crisis point had passed. German forces were now fighting defensively, trying to hold their gains against increasing Allied pressure. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal. He insisted German forces continue attacking. But the offensive was finished. Fuel was exhausted. Casualties were mounting. Allied pressure was overwhelming. By early January 1945, Allied forces were pushing German units back toward their start lines. The Battle of the Bulge would continue until late January, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German offensive had failed. The cost was staggering. American forces suffered approximately 90,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed and 23,000 captured. British forces suffered 1,400 casualties. German forces suffered an estimated 100,000 casualties. Over 800 tanks were destroyed on both sides. Hundreds of aircraft were lost. Thousands of civilians in the battle zone were killed or displaced. For the United States Army, the Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle of World War II. But the strategic implications went beyond casualty figures. Germany had expended its last operational reserves. The tanks, fuel, ammunition, and most critically, the experienced soldiers committed to the offensive were irreplaceable. After the Bulge, Germany had no capacity for strategic operations. The Western Front would collapse in spring 1945, not because Allied forces were particularly stronger, but because German forces were exhausted.
Eisenhower's reckoning with the intelligence failure was immediate and thorough. On December 20th, even as the battle raged, he ordered a complete review of intelligence procedures. How had this happened? The investigation revealed multiple systemic failures. First, Allied intelligence had become over-reliant on signals intelligence. Ultra-intercepts had been so valuable for so long that intelligence officers assumed that anything not appearing in ultra wasn't important. When Germans imposed radio silence for the Ardennes offensive, ultra went blind, and intelligence officers didn't recognize the significance of the silence itself. Second, tactical intelligence from frontline units was being discounted in favor of higher-level assessments. Ground commanders had reported increased German activity, but intelligence headquarters dismissed these reports as local phenomena. The intelligence system was too centralized, too distant from actual conditions. Third, intelligence analysis was suffering from mirror imaging. Allied analysts assumed German commanders thought like Allied commanders, that German decisions would follow rational military logic. But Hitler's decisions were driven by political and ideological considerations that Allied analysts didn't understand or account for. Fourth, there was institutional resistance to revising assessments. Intelligence officers who had declared Germany finished didn't want to admit they were wrong. Reports contradicting established assessments were marginalized. This created an echo chamber where the prevailing narrative reinforced itself. Fifth, security compartmentalization had created problems. Different intelligence agencies weren't sharing information effectively. Signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, and agent reports were analyzed separately. No one was integrating all sources into a comprehensive picture. The most damning finding was that intelligence officers had allowed optimism to cloud judgment. The desire to believe the war was nearly over had made intelligence analysis wishful rather than rigorous. Officers had interpreted ambiguous evidence in the most favorable way, rather than considering worst-case scenarios. This is perhaps the most fundamental intelligence failure, allowing what you want to be true to influence what you assess is true. Eisenhower implemented immediate reforms. Intelligence from all sources would be integrated daily. Frontline commanders' reports would be given greater weight. Alternative assessments challenging prevailing views would be actively encouraged. Intelligence officers would be rotated regularly to prevent institutional bias. Most importantly, intelligence assessments would explicitly include confidence levels and alternative interpretations. But Eisenhower also recognized his own responsibility. He had accepted intelligence assessments uncritically because they aligned with his strategic plans. He had positioned weak divisions in the Ardennes because intelligence said it was safe. He had failed to question the assumption that Germany was finished. As Supreme Commander, ultimate responsibility was his. Eisenhower didn't make excuses. In reports to Washington and in meetings with subordinates, he acknowledged the failure. The Ardennes offensive should have been detected. The intelligence failure had cost thousands of lives. He was accountable. This accountability was characteristic of Eisenhower's leadership style. He accepted responsibility for failures while giving credit for successes to subordinates. It earned him immense loyalty from his commanders and troops. The broader strategic question was whether the Ardennes offensive had changed the war's outcome. The answer was clearly no. Germany had failed to reach any strategic objectives. Antwerp was never threatened. The Allied armies weren't split. No major Allied units were destroyed, except the 2 regiments of the 106th Division. The Meuse River crossings were never secured. Within 6 weeks, Allied forces had regained all lost ground and were positioned to resume their advance into Germany. If anything, the offensive accelerated Germany's defeat. The reserves expended in the Ardennes would have been more valuable defending Germany's borders in early 1945. Hitler's insistence on an impossible offensive objective had wasted Germany's last strategic assets. In retrospect, the Battle of the Bulge was Germany's final spasm, desperate and ultimately futile. But for the soldiers who fought in the Ardennes in December 1944 and January 1945, these strategic considerations were abstract. They fought in brutal winter conditions, in heavy snow and freezing temperatures, against desperate German forces fighting with fanatical determination. The battle produced stories of incredible courage and sacrifice. The defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne became legendary. When German forces demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word response, "Nuts," became famous. Small unit actions throughout the battle demonstrated American resilience and adaptability. Units cut off and surrounded continued fighting. Ad hoc battle groups formed and held critical positions. Soldiers fought in conditions they weren't trained for, against an enemy they'd been told was defeated, and prevailed through determination and courage. The civilian population of the Ardennes suffered terribly. Towns and villages became battlefields. Civilians were caught between armies. Many were killed in the fighting. Others fled westward as refugees. Property destruction was extensive. When the battle ended, the region was devastated. It would take years to rebuild. The Battle of the Bulge also produced one of the worst atrocities. At Malmedy, on December 17th, German SS troops executed approximately 84 American prisoners of war. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, enraged American forces and hardened attitudes toward German troops, particularly SS units. Quarter was seldom given to SS troops after Malmedy. The atrocity also reinforced the moral clarity of the war against Nazi Germany.
Hitler's role in the Ardennes offensive revealed the extent of his detachment from reality by late 1944. He had designed the operation based on fantasy rather than facts. He had assumed Germany had resources it didn't have. He had assumed Allied forces would collapse under pressure, which they didn't. He had assumed Germany could replicate the success of 1940, ignoring how much had changed in 4 years. The operation was based on Hitler's wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. This pattern would characterize German operations for the remainder of the war. Hitler would order counterattacks and offensives that existed only on maps, demanding his armies hold positions that were militarily untenable, refusing to authorize retreats even when encirclement was imminent. The Ardennes offensive was the last time Germany had sufficient resources to even attempt executing Hitler's fantasies. After the Bulge, German military operations became increasingly detached from reality. Eisenhower's analysis of what went wrong strategically went beyond intelligence failures. He recognized that the Allied strategy of broad front advance had created vulnerabilities. By attacking everywhere, Allied forces were strong nowhere.
The Ardennes had been left weak because forces were needed elsewhere. Montgomery had been advocating for a concentrated thrust into Germany rather than broad front advance. The Ardennes offensive seemed to validate Montgomery's criticism. Perhaps if Allied forces had been concentrated rather than spread across the entire front, German forces wouldn't have found a weak point to exploit. But Eisenhower rejected this analysis. The broad front strategy had brought Allied forces to Germany's borders by December 1944. A concentrated thrust might have advanced faster in one sector, but would have left flanks exposed and supply lines vulnerable. The Ardennes attack had succeeded in creating tactical surprise and initial gains, but it had failed strategically. No amount of concentrated Allied force could have prevented Germany from attempting some offensive if Hitler was determined to attack. The real lesson, Eisenhower concluded, was about intelligence and assumptions. Allied commanders had assumed Germany was defeated and had stopped critically evaluating that assumption. They had allowed strategic optimism to override tactical caution. The result was that when Germany attacked, Allied forces weren't prepared. The solution wasn't changing strategy, it was improving intelligence analysis and maintaining healthy skepticism about assumptions. This lesson would influence Eisenhower's thinking for the rest of his life, including during his later presidency. Never assume. Always verify. Question prevailing assumptions. Prepare for worst cases, even while hoping for best cases. These principles, learned in the Ardennes, would guide Eisenhower's approach to Cold War challenges when he became president. The Battle of the Bulge also demonstrated American military resilience and adaptability. American forces, despite initial shock and significant losses, had recovered quickly. Reinforcements had moved rapidly. Logistics had responded effectively despite winter conditions and damaged infrastructure. Commanders had coordinated responses despite communication difficulties. Individual units had fought effectively even when cut off and surrounded. The battle revealed that by late 1944, the American military had become a formidable fighting force, capable of absorbing surprises and responding flexibly. This was very different from the inexperienced army that had struggled in North Africa in 1942 or in Italy in 1943. 3 years of war had transformed the American military into one of the most effective armies in the world. The intelligence failure at the Bulge had one unexpected benefit. It destroyed complacency. After the Ardennes, Allied intelligence never again assumed Germany was finished until German forces actually surrendered in May 1945. Every German unit movement was scrutinized. Every intelligence report was evaluated rigorously. Alternative scenarios were developed for every situation. The overconfidence of November 1944 was replaced by careful, methodical analysis. In that sense, the intelligence failure served as a valuable corrective. It prevented potentially worse failures later. The cost was high, thousands of casualties that might have been avoided. But the lesson was learned thoroughly. Eisenhower's relationship with his intelligence chiefs changed after the Bulge. He became more skeptical of their assessments, more willing to challenge their conclusions, more insistent on seeing raw intelligence rather than processed analysis. He started meeting directly with intelligence collectors, not just analysts, to hear frontline perspectives without filtering. He encouraged dissenting views and alternative assessments. This made intelligence work more difficult for his staff, but it produced better results. Intelligence assessments became more nuanced, more careful about confidence levels, more willing to acknowledge uncertainty. The change in approach prevented similar surprises during the final months of the war. The German generals who had opposed Hitler's Ardennes plan were proven right, but vindication brought no satisfaction. The offensive had consumed Germany's last reserves for no strategic gain. Field Marshal von Rundstedt reportedly said after the war that the Ardennes offensive was the moment he knew Germany had absolutely lost. Not because the offensive failed, but because Hitler had ordered it at all. Any rational assessment of German situation in December 1944 would have concluded that offensive operations were impossible. The fact that Hitler ordered the offensive anyway, that he committed Germany's last reserves to an unachievable objective, proved that German strategy was no longer based on reality. From that point forward, Germany was simply prolonging the inevitable. For the soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, the battle remained a defining experience. Survivors spoke of the cold, the confusion, the intensity of the fighting, and the uncertainty of those desperate weeks. They spoke of comrades lost, of units surrounded and fighting their way out, of American resilience against overwhelming odds. The Battle of the Bulge became a source of pride for veterans, proof that American forces could absorb a major surprise attack and still prevail. The battle entered American military legend alongside Gettysburg and the Alamo as a defining moment of courage under extreme pressure. December 16, 1944, taught Eisenhower and Allied commanders a lesson they never forgot. Never underestimate a desperate enemy. Germany in December 1944 appeared defeated, its resources exhausted, its armies broken. But a combination of Hitler's fanaticism, German military professionalism, and Allied complacency had created conditions for one last shock. The shock didn't change the war's outcome, but it reminded everyone that wars aren't won until they're actually over, that assumptions can be deadly, and that intelligence failures can cost thousands of lives. In his headquarters that morning, receiving the first fragmentary reports of the German offensive, Eisenhower realized the catastrophic scope of the Allied intelligence failure. Everything he'd been told about German capabilities was wrong. Every assumption about German intentions was incorrect. The war wasn't nearly over. The hardest fighting was just beginning. And thousands of American soldiers in the Ardennes were paying the price for that miscalculation. December 16, 1944.